It is the summer of 1944. German troops are confidently holding their defenses in Belarus, considering this section of the front to be completely calm. Their commander even goes on vacation. But at this time, an operation is being secretly prepared that will become one of the greatest triumphs in the history of military art. How did the Soviet command manage to outmaneuver the Germans so brilliantly that they did not believe what was happening even when the offensive began? What caused Army Group Center to turn from a formidable force into a crowd of fleeing soldiers in a matter of days? And why did Operation Bagration become a turning point in the entire Second World War? Now you will learn the whole truth about the Red Army's most successful operation. By the summer of 1944, the front line in Eastern Europe had taken on a peculiar configuration. From Vitebsk through Orsha, Mogilev and to Zlobin, there was a huge protrusion that military historians would later call the Belarusian balcony. This wedge, pointing deep into the Soviet Union, was a real thorn in the side of the liberated country. Imagine a map of military operations. While the Red Army was achieving impressive successes in Ukraine, pushing German troops further and further west, the Belarusian front remained virtually unchanged. Here, among the forests and swamps, the front seemed to have frozen in anticipation. The German Army Group Center held its positions firmly, threatening the flanks of the advancing Soviet troops. What was this enemy force? It consisted of 43 divisions and several separate units with a total strength of about 800,000 men. This powerful force was commanded by Field Marshal Ernst Busch, an experienced military leader who had risen from regimental commander in World War I to become one of Germany's leading strategists. The German positions in Belarus had been turned into a veritable fortress. Months of relative calm allowed the Wehrmacht's engineering troops to create a deeply echeloned defense system, pillboxes and dugouts, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and wire barriers surrounded Belarusian towns and villages. The so-called Festungs, or fortress cities, which Hitler ordered to be held at all costs, were particularly well fortified. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk became centers of resistance, capable of withstanding a prolonged siege. The German command was convinced that breaking through such defenses would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. The marshy terrain, dense forests, numerous rivers and streams, the very nature of Belarus seemed to be working in favor of the defenders. But there was one detail that should have alerted the German strategists. From October 1943 to April 1944, the Red Army made 11 attempts to break through to Minsk and Orsha. All these operations ended in failure or achieved only limited success. Soviet troops were literally smashed against the German defenses, suffering heavy losses. It was this fact that proved fatal for Army Group Center. The German command drew a dangerous conclusion. Since the Red Army had been unable to break through the defenses in winter and spring, it would not repeat its unsuccessful attempts in summer. At first glance, the logic was ironclad. Why bang your head against a wall when you can build on success where it has already been achieved? This confidence in the impregnability of the Belarusian positions permeated the entire German military machine, from the rank and file to the high command. Army Group Center was predicted to have a quiet summer. Tank and air units were gradually transferred to other sections of the front, where the main events of the summer campaign were expected. But the Soviet command was preparing a surprise that would exceed even the wildest expectations and become one of the greatest triumphs of military art in human history. In the luxurious halls of Berchtesgaden, surrounded by alpine landscapes, Adolf Hitler studied maps of the Eastern Front. The spring of 1944 brought the Führer many reasons for concern. But the Belarusian front was not among them. On the contrary, it was here that the German dictator saw proof of the steadfastness of his troops and the correctness of his chosen strategy. Hitler was convinced that the Red Army's next strike would come either in the south, from Ukraine towards Warsaw, or in the north, towards the Baltic states. This choice seemed logical to him from a military point of view. A strike from the south would allow Soviet troops to cut off Army Group Center and North from Germany, while an advance towards the Baltic Sea threatened to isolate the entire Northern Wehrmacht group. German intelligence worked with redoubled energy to decipher Soviet plans. Agents reported troop movements in the area around the Ukrainian city of Kovel. Aerial reconnaissance recorded the construction of airfields and warehouses south of the Belarusian salient. Radio interception registered active activity at headquarters in Ukraine. Everything pointed to the fact that the main strike would come from here. But there was one detail that should have alerted German analysts. The Soviet side seemed to be deliberately demonstrating its preparations in Ukraine. It was too open, too noticeable for an army that had learned to masterfully conceal its intentions. However, Berlin took this information at face value. Hitler approved the distribution of reserves in accordance with the expected threats. The best tank divisions were sent to Ukraine and the Baltic states. Air squadrons were redeployed to those sections of the front where the main events were expected. Army Group Center was to make do with minimal forces. The Führer was so confident in the accuracy of his predictions that he even spoke of the possibility of switching to a strategic defense in Belarus. In his opinion, strong fortifications and natural obstacles would allow positions to be held with small forces, freeing up troops for operations in more important areas. This self-confidence permeated all levels of the German command. Officers of Army Group Center's headquarters were even planning their summer vacations. The commander of the Fourth Army, General Tippelskirch, later recalled that the mood among the troops was calm. There was no information that would have allowed them to predict the direction of the Russian offensive. German strategists proceeded from a logic that seemed flawless. The Red Army always sought to build on success, where it had already been achieved. In Ukraine, Soviet troops had achieved impressive results, which meant that the offensive was likely to continue there. In Belarus, however, all attempts to break through had failed, which meant that Stalin would not waste his forces on attacks that were doomed to failure. However, German analysts failed to take one important factor into account. The Red Army of Tychy-Sforza was radically different from the army that retreated in the first months of the war. Now it was a powerful, technically equipped and experienced military machine capable of solving the most complex tasks. And its command had learned not only to fight but also to deceive the enemy. While plans were being made in Berlin to defend against non-existent threats, an operation was being prepared in Moscow that would go down in history as a masterpiece of military art and mark the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. Hitler's illusions were about to be shattered by reality. In April 1944, work invisible to the outside world was in full swing in the offices of the Red Army General Staff. Deputy Chief of the General Staff, Army General Alexei Ivanovich Antonov, received a special assignment from the Supreme Command Headquarters to develop a plan for a grand offensive operation in Belarus. Antonov's selection for this task was no accident. This man possessed a rare gift for strategic thinking and the ability to see war in its entirety. His analytical mind and ability to calculate several moves ahead made him one of the most valuable officers in the Soviet General Staff. Initial work revealed the complexity of the task ahead. The Belarusian theater of operations was a veritable maze of natural obstacles. Dense forests alternated with impassable swamps, and numerous rivers and streams crisscrossed the terrain in all directions. Roads were few and far between, and mostly unpaved, making it difficult for heavy equipment to move around. But Antonov saw these obstacles not only as problems, but also as opportunities. If the Soviet troops managed to secretly concentrate in their starting areas, the natural conditions that hindered their advance would also prevent the Germans from quickly transferring their reserves. The main scene was to achieve the element of surprise. The plan for the operation was developed gradually, taking into account the opinions of the front commanders. Konstantin Rokossovsky, commander of the First Belarusian Front, was particularly active in the discussion. This outstanding commander proposed an unconventional solution: to strike not from one direction, but from two directions along his front. Rokossovsky's idea sparked a heated debate in the general headquarters. Most military leaders believed that spreading forces was unacceptable. It would be better to concentrate all forces in one direction and achieve a decisive breakthrough. But Rokossovsky insisted on his plan. In his opinion, two strikes would create complete uncertainty for the enemy and prevent them from concentrating their reserves against the main threat. The debate went on for a few days. In the end, Stalin backed Rokossovsky's proposal. This decision would turn out to be one of the key factors in the success of the future operation. The German command, used to Soviet attacks in one direction, simply couldn't respond properly to multiple breakthroughs. By the end of May, the plan for the operation was ready. It was given the code name Bagration in honor of the hero of the patriotic war of 1812, General Pyotr Ivanovich Bagration, who commanded the Second Russian Army on Belarusian soil. The symbolism was obvious. Just as 132 years ago Russian troops had driven the invaders from this land, so now the Red Army was to liberate Belarus from the German occupiers. The plan of the operation envisaged simultaneous strikes on 4 fronts in 6 directions. An offensive of this scale had never been attempted before in the entire war. The 1st Baltic, 3rd, 2nd and 1st Belarusian fronts were to break through the German defenses, encircle the main forces of Army Group Center and advance deep into enemy territory. The operation was reminiscent of the famous Brusila breakthrough during World War I, but it surpassed it in scale and complexity. While General Brusilov had advanced in 4 directions, now 6 simultaneous strikes were planned. This was supposed to completely disorient the enemy and deprive him of the ability to maneuver his reserves. The birth of Operation Bagration was the result of the collective creativity of the best minds of the Red Army. Now it was time to turn the plan into reality. In the history of military art, few operations can compare with Bagration in terms of secrecy and the art of disinformation. The Soviet command turned the preparations for the offensive into a real spectacle, where every detail was sought out to the smallest detail, and the main role was played by deceiving the enemy. The scale of the operation to mislead the Germans is mind-boggling. While fake airfields and warehouses were being built in the area around the Ukrainian city of Kovel, real preparations for the offensive in Belarus were being carried out in the strictest secrecy. Every movement of troops took place only under cover of night. Radio silence was observed so strictly that even division commanders received orders directly from front commanders. The genius of the Soviet disinformation plan lay not only in what was hidden, but also in what was shown. In Ukraine, troops were deliberately concentrated in open areas, river crossings were built and ammunition depots were set up. German aerial reconnaissance regularly recorded all these preparations and reported to Berlin about the impending attack from the south. But the most sophisticated element of disinformation was radio communications. The radio stations of Tank Corps, which were actually being transferred to Belarus, continued to operate on their previous frequencies in the Kovel area. After it, German radio intelligence confidently tracked the location of large formations, unaware that it was communicating with fake radio stations. The level of secrecy in Belarus itself reached incredible heights. Air Force commanders learned of the upcoming operation only 5 to 7 days before it began. Pilots received their combat missions a few hours before takeoff. The air units themselves were based 200 kilometers from the front line and flew to the forward airfields at the very last moment. Sappers were given a special task that at first glance seemed absurd. They did not completely clear the minefields in the direction of the upcoming offensive, but only unscrewed the fuses from the mines. This allowed the positions to appear intact to German observers and, at the right moment, quickly secure passages for the advancing troops. Even the details of everyday life were subordinated to the task of camouflage. Soldiers continued to dig trenches and build dugouts in old positions, creating the impression of a long-term deployment. At the same time, the true starting positions for the offensive were only prepared in the last days before the operation. Troop movements were carried out with maximum secrecy. Echelons with tanks and artillery moved along the railways only at night, standing in dense forests under camouflage nets during the day. Motor vehicle convoys used country roads, avoiding large populated areas. Even the local population was often unaware of the scale of what was happening. Partisans played a special role in the disinformation operation. Belarusian Avengers not only conducted reconnaissance of German positions, but also spread false rumors among the local population. They told stories about an alleged offensive in Ukraine, the transfer of Soviet troops to the Baltic states, and anything else that would distract attention from the command's real plans. Even nature seemed to be helping the Soviet troops. The White Nights of June created additional opportunities for covert movement. During this period, twilight lasted a long time, allowing troops to take up their starting positions under cover of semi-darkness. The result of this grandiose disinformation operation exceeded all expectations. The German command was so completely misled that, even on the day of the offensive, it did not believe in the seriousness of what was happening. On the morning of June 19, 1944, Field Marshal Ernst Busch made a decision that would go down in history as a symbol of German self-confidence. The commander of Army Group Center announced his intention to take leave and return to his family in Germany. This happened just 4 days before the start of Operation Bagration. Busch was an experienced military leader who had risen from regimental commander in World War I to one of the Wehrmacht's leading strategists. His military career had been successful, with participation in the Polish campaign, brilliant actions in Russia, and the defense of Leningrad. It seemed that this man should have had enough intuition to foresee the impending disaster. But the field marshal was confident in the impregnability of his positions. Months of successful defense of the Belarusian salient had given him a feeling of complete security. Intelligence reports contain no alarming information about Soviet preparations in his area of responsibility. On the contrary, all reports pointed to enemy activity in the Kavel area and in the Baltic states. Bush's decision to take leave was not just a personal whim. It reflected the general mood of the German command on this section of the front. The officers of the Army Group headquarters were also planning their summer vacations. The troops were in a state of relative calm, conducting routine exercises and strengthening their defensive positions. The commander of the 4th Army, General Tipelskirch, later recalled the atmosphere of those days. There was no information that would have allowed us to predict the direction of the Russians' planned summer offensive. Aviation and radio intelligence usually accurately detected large movements of Russian forces, but no such signs were observed in Belarus. Army Groups Center and North were predicted to have a quiet summer. This atmosphere of complacency permeated all levels of the German military hierarchy. Soldiers wrote letters home, officers planned vacations, and rear services worked as usual. No one expected that in just a few days their world would be turned upside down. Particularly telling was the fact that the German command continued to transfer troops from the Belarusian front to other sections of the front. Tank divisions were sent to counter the expected offensive in Ukraine. Air squadrons were relocated to the Baltic states. Even artillery units were transferred to neighboring groups. Bush did not simply go on vacation. He demonstratively showed his disregard for the possible threat. The field marshal planned to spend several weeks with his family, take a break from the hardships of military service, and return in the fall, when, in his opinion, serious combat operations could begin. This decision was made possible by the complete misinformation spread by the Soviet command. German intelligence was so misled that the commander of the army group thought it was okay to leave his post at the most critical moment. The fate of Bush himself was ironic. When the Soviet offensive began on June 23, the field marshal was hundreds of kilometers away from his troops. He had to return to the front urgently, but it was too late. The disaster was gathering momentum with every passing hour. Hitler did not forgive Bush for this vacation. Just a few days after the start of Operation Bagration, the field marshal was dismissed and remained out of office until April 1945. But the commander's resignation could no longer change the course of events. Army Group Center was doomed. Bush's leave became a symbol of how completely the Soviet command had managed to mislead the enemy. When a military leader of such high rank considers it possible to leave his troops on the eve of a major battle, it means the absolute failure of German intelligence and the complete success of Soviet disinformation. By the start of Operation Bagration, the Red Army had concentrated forces against Army Group Center on a scale that was beyond imagination. 4 fronts, the 1st Baltic, 3rd, 2nd, and 1st Belarusian, combined 168 divisions and 12 tank corps with a total strength of more than 2.4 million men. These figures spoke eloquently of the importance the Soviet command attached to the Belarusian operation. Never before had so many troops been concentrated in a single strategic direction. By way of comparison, during the counter-offensive at Stalingrad, the Red Army deployed about 1 million men, while here there were more than twice as many. What stood against this power? Army Group Center had 43 divisions and several separate units, totaling about 800,000 men. The ratio of forces was more than 3-to-1 in favor of the attackers. But it was not just a matter of numbers. The quality of the Soviet troops also significantly surpassed that of the enemy. The superiority in technology was particularly impressive. The Red Army had almost 6,000 tanks and self-propelled artillery units against 270 German ones. The ratio was 23-to-1. This meant that for every German tank, there were almost 25 Soviet combat vehicles. The superiority in artillery was no less impressive. 36,000 guns and mortars of the Red Army faced 3,800 German ones. The ratio of 9.5-to-1 enabled Soviet troops to create a density of fire that the Germans had never seen before in the entire war. Air superiority was almost absolute. More than 5,000 Soviet aircraft were preparing to descend on 470 Luftwaffe aircraft. A ratio of more than 10-to-1 guaranteed the Red Army air superiority from the very first minutes of the operation. But numbers are only part of the story. The qualitative superiority of the Soviet troops was no less important. By the summer of 1944, the Red Army was a well-trained, technically equipped and morally stable force. Soldiers and officers had extensive combat experience, and the troops were well supplied with modern weapons. Tank units received the latest vehicles, the latest modifications of the T-34, heavy IS-2 tanks, and various types of self-propelled guns. The artillery had weapons of all calibers, from light anti-tank guns to heavy howitzers of special power. The Air Force included modern fighters, attack aircraft and bombers. German troops, on the other hand, were in decline. The best divisions had been transferred to other sections of the front or had been lost in previous battles. The remaining units were mainly made up of young soldiers with insufficient combat experience or elderly reservists. The technical equipment of Army Group Center also left much to be desired. The tank units were mainly equipped with obsolete vehicles or captured equipment. The artillery suffered from an acute shortage of ammunition. The Air Force was represented by a small number of aircraft, many of which were in need of repair. The situation of the German Air Force was particularly dire. At the start of the operation, the 6th Air Fleet had only 40 serviceable fighters. The rest had been destroyed in air battles or damaged during attacks on airfields. Such a small number of aircraft could not even provide basic reconnaissance, let alone support for ground forces. But the most important factor was the morale of the opposing sides. The Red Army went on the offensive with a clear goal: to liberate their homeland from the invaders. Every soldier understood that he was fighting for a just cause. The German troops, on the other hand, increasingly questioned the meaning of continuing the war. The balance of forces was so clearly in favor of the Red Army that the success of the operation seemed a foregone conclusion. But the Soviet command did not rely solely on numerical superiority. Thorough preparation and the skill of the military leaders were to ensure not just victory, but the complete defeat of the enemy. June 23, 1944 is a date that will forever go down in history as the day Operation Bagration began. It is symbolic that the offensive began exactly 3 years after Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. Now the Red Army was preparing to strike a blow that would mark the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. The dawn was foggy. The Belarusian forests and swamps were hidden in a milky haze, which was ideal for the surprise of the impending attack. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the partisans were the first to enter the battle. According to a pre-planned strategy, the People's Avengers attacked the enemy's railway communications. In one night, the partisans blew up more than 10,000 rails on the most important railway lines. This was Operation Rail War, which was intended to paralyze German communications and deprive the enemy of the ability to quickly transfer reserves. The sounds of explosions in the rear were the first sign of impending disaster for Army Group Center. At 5 in the morning, reconnaissance in force began. Soviet advance units attacked German positions, trying to identify the enemy's fire system and determine weak points in the defense. These attacks were limited in nature, but they already made the German command wary. A real storm broke out on the German positions at 6 in the morning. More than 30,000 Red Army guns and mortars opened fire across the entire front line from Vitebsk to Bobruisk. Artillery preparation of such power had never been carried out before in the entire war. The earth shook from the continuous roar of gunfire. German soldiers in the front trenches felt defenseless for the first time in a long time. They were used to periodic shelling, but what was happening now exceeded all their expectations of war. Shells fell so frequently that the air literally hummed from their explosions. Simultaneously with the artillery preparation, squadrons of Soviet aircraft took to the air. More than 1,000 planes launched a massive strike against German airfields, communication centers and command posts. Air superiority was established in the first hours of the operation. At 6:30 in the morning, the artillery fire was moved deeper into the German defenses, and the infantry and tanks went on the offensive. On the section of the First Baltic Front, northwest of Vitebsk, troops under the command of General Bagration advanced. Their task was to encircle the enemy group in Vitebsk. General Chernyakhovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front struck at the positions of the German 3rd Panzer Army. The main objective was to capture Vitebsk and link up with the troops of the 1st Baltic Front to complete the encirclement. Zakharov's 2nd Belarusian Front attacked in the direction of Mogilev. This strike was intended to pin down the German 4th Army and prevent it from coming to the aid of neighboring groups. The most powerful strike was delivered by Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front. According to the plan, which was defended by the commander himself, the offensive was carried out in 2 directions, on Slutsk and Osipovich. This ruse was intended to completely confuse the German command. The first reports from the front were strikingly optimistic. Soviet troops were breaking through German defenses on all fronts simultaneously. The enemy was unable to respond to the multiple threats and lost control of its troops. By the end of the day, it was clear that the operation was developing according to the most favorable scenario. The Red Army broke through the first line of German defenses on a front stretching more than 400 kilometers. Army Group Center found itself in a critical situation in the first day of the battle. June 23, 1944 was the day when, for the first time in the entire war, the German military machine found itself completely disoriented and helpless in the face of the Soviet offensive. By the end of the second day of Operation Bagration, it was clear that the German command had completely lost control of the situation. The Red Army did not simply break through the enemy's defenses, it methodically surrounded and destroyed large enemy groups. The garrisons of Vitebsk and Bobruisk were the first to fall into the deadly embrace. Vitebsk was one of the fortresses that Hitler ordered to be held at all costs. The city was home to units of the 53rd Army Corps, about 30,000 men under the command of General Golwitz. These troops were supposed to become an impregnable bastion in the path of the Soviet advance. But the Soviet command's plan was not to storm Vitebsk head-on, but to surround it. The troops of the First Baltic Front under the command of General Bagration broke through north of the city, and units of General Chernyakhovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front broke through to the south. By June 25, the ring around the Vitebsk group had closed. Golwitz realized the hopelessness of his situation and requested permission from the command to break through. But Hitler categorically forbade leaving the fortress. The Führer demanded that Vitebsk be held to the last soldier, promising to unblock the surrounded garrison with a strike from outside. This help never came. Army Group Center simply did not have the reserves to carry out a relief operation. All available forces were engaged in repelling Soviet attacks in other directions. The Vitebsk group was doomed to destruction. Golwitz tried to break out of the encirclement, disobeying Hitler's direct order. On June 27, the remnants of the 53rd Corps made a desperate attempt to break through to the west. But it was too late. Soviet troops had securely blocked all escape routes. By June 28, the Vitebsk Cauldron had been liquidated. More than 20,000 German soldiers and officers were taken prisoner, including Golwitz himself. The rest were killed or scattered in the forests. One of the strongest groups of Army Group Center ceased to exist. At the same time, an equally dramatic situation was unfolding near Bobruisk. Here, units of the 9th Army Corps, numbering about 40,000 men, were surrounded. This group was commanded by General Jordan, an experienced military leader who had fought throughout the war from Poland to Belarus. The Bobruisk Cauldron was formed as a result of the rapid advance of the troops of the First Belarusian Front. Rokossovsky's tank corps broke through the German defenses and advanced 70 kilometers in 2 days, joining forces east of Bobruisk. Jordan found himself in a more advantageous position than Golwitz. His troops were less surrounded, and the terrain, forests and swamps, was favorable for small groups to break through. But the German general also received a categorical order from Hitler to hold the fortress. An attempt to break the blockade of Bobruisk was made on June 27 by the 20th Panzer Division. But this division had already been so weakened by previous battles that it was unable to break through to the surrounded garrison. On the contrary, it itself came under attack by Soviet troops and suffered heavy losses. By June 29, the fate of the Bobruisk group was sealed. Jordan, like Golwitzer, tried to break out of the encirclement, but it was too late. Soviet troops methodically tightened the ring, destroying pockets of resistance one by one. The liquidation of the Bobruisk Cauldron was completed on July 1st. More than 24,000 German soldiers and officers were taken prisoner. Jordan was among the captives. Another large group of Army Group Center ceased to exist. The encirclement and destruction of the Vitebsk and Bobruisk groups became a classic example of the use of the Cauldron tactic. The Soviet command demonstrated the highest level of skill in coordinating the actions of various fronts and the ability to use superior mobility to achieve strategic goals. During a week of fighting, Army Group Center lost about 70,000 men killed and captured. It was a disaster of unprecedented scale, from which the German troops in Belarus were unable to recover. By the end of the first week of July 1944, it became clear that Army Group Center was experiencing a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. What had been one of the most powerful formations of the Wehrmacht just a week earlier had turned into crowds of scattered retreating units trying to escape the relentless advance of the Soviet troops. The fall of Vitebsk and Bobruisk was only the beginning. The Red Army, giving the enemy no respite, continued its rapid advance. The pace of the advance amazed even the Soviet commanders themselves. Tank corps were advancing at a rate of 30 to 40 kilometers per day, which was an incredible speed for the wooded and marshy terrain of Belarus. General Tipelskir's German Fourth Army found itself in what military historians call a strategic collapse. Its units were broken up into separate groups that lost contact with each other and with their command. Radio stations were silent, couriers could not get through the Soviet lines, and reconnaissance planes were shot down before they even reached the front. The situation was particularly dire for the Ninth Army, which was supposed to cover the southern flank of the group. Its commander, General Jordan, was captured near Bobruisk, and the remnants of the army retreated westward in disorder, pursued by mobile Red Army groups. General Reingard's 3rd Tank Army tried to hold the line along the Berezina River, but Soviet troops crossed the water barrier on the move. German sappers did not have time to prepare bridges for demolition. The offensive was developing so rapidly that there was no time for engineering work. The command of Army Group Center completely lost control of the situation. The headquarters of Field Marshal Bush, who had returned urgently from leave, rushed from one crisis to another, trying to stabilize the front in any way possible. But each new report brought only bad news. On July 2nd, Soviet troops liberated Mogilev. This city had also been declared a fortress by Hitler, but its garrison did not even last a day under siege. The remnants of the German units retreated across the Dnieper, abandoning their heavy weapons and equipment. But the hardest blow for the German command was the news that Soviet Tank Corps had reached the outskirts of Minsk. The Belarusian capital was not just a large city, it was a major transport hub, through which the main communications of Army Group Center passed. The loss of Minsk meant the final collapse of the German group. Units still fighting east of the capital found themselves cut off from their lines of retreat. Supplies were cut off, communications were disrupted, and command of the troops became impossible. Hitler demanded that Minsk be held at all costs, but Field Marshal Bush was forced to report that there were neither troops nor time to defend the city. All reserves had been exhausted in the first days of the battle, and reinforcements from other fronts did not arrive in time. On July 3, Minsk fell. Soviet tankers broke into the city from several directions at once, meeting no serious resistance. The German garrison partially surrendered and partially fled to the west. The Belarusian capital was liberated after 3 years of occupation. The fall of Minsk became a symbol of the collapse of the entire German defense in Belarus. In 10 days of fighting, Army Group Center lost about 300,000 men, more than half of its strength. 17 divisions and 3 brigades were completely destroyed, and another 50 divisions lost more than half of their personnel. The scale of the disaster was such that for the first time in the war, the German command was unable to restore the front to its previous lines. The Red Army broke through the defenses to a depth of 600 kilometers, creating a huge gap in the German defense line. Bush was immediately removed from command and replaced by Field Marshal Model, one of the Wehrmacht's best defensive specialists. But even the Führer's fireman, as Model was called in the German army, could not perform a miracle and restore the defeated group. The collapse of Army Group Center meant the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. The road to Berlin was open. On July 3, 1944, another golden page was written in the history of the Great Patriotic War. On that day, Soviet troops liberated Minsk, the capital of Belarus, which had been under German occupation for more than 3 years. The fall of the city was not only an important strategic success, but also a powerful symbol of the collapse of German rule on Soviet soil. The offensive on Minsk was carried out by forces from 3 fronts at once: the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st Belarusian fronts. This operation became a model of coordination between large military formations. General Rotmistrov's Tank Corps from the north, General Zakharov's troops from the east, and Rokossovsky's mobile groups from the south converged on the Belarusian capital, closing the last ring of encirclement around the remnants of Army Group Center. By the morning of July 2, the advance units of General Volkov's 5th Guards Tank Corps were already fighting on the eastern approaches to the city. The German garrison in Minsk, numbering about 15,000 men, tried to organize a defense in pre-prepared positions. But the forces were too unequal. The city's defense was commanded by General Müller, an experienced officer who understood the hopelessness of the situation. Communication with the higher command had been lost the day before, when Soviet troops cut all telephone lines and captured radio stations. The garrison was left to fend for itself, surrounded by rapidly advancing Soviet units. A distinctive feature of the fighting from Minsk was that the city was attacked from 3 sides at once. Tanks of the 2nd Belarusian front advanced from the northeast, units of the 3rd Belarusian front from the east, and Rokossovsky's mobile groups approached from the south. This tactic prevented the enemy from concentrating its forces in any one direction. On the morning of July 3, Soviet tanks broke into the suburbs of Minsk. The first to enter the city were units of the 2nd Guards Tank Corps under the command of General Burdeiny. His tanks broke through to the central part of the city, capturing the railway station and the post office, key objects, control of which meant domination over the entire city. German resistance was sporadic and disorganized. Small groups of soldiers tried to hold on to stone buildings in the city center, but they lacked ammunition and coordination. Many German units had already begun retreating westward, seeking to break out of the encirclement that was forming. By noon on July 3, the main fighting in the city had ended. General Müller and the remnants of his staff attempted to break through to their troops, but were captured along with most of the garrison. About 3,000 German soldiers and officers surrendered to Soviet troops, while the rest were killed or fled. The liberation of Minsk was not only of military significance, but also of enormous political importance. It was the first Allied republic whose capital was completely liberated from the German invaders. It is symbolic that this happened in Belarus, a republic that suffered perhaps the heaviest losses of the entire war. But the main strategic significance of the liberation of Minsk was that the fall of the city finally cut the army group center into pieces. German troops remaining east of the Belarusian capital found themselves completely surrounded. Their fate was sealed. Only capture or death awaited them. On the night of July 4, fireworks lit up the sky over Moscow in honor of the liberation of Minsk. 24 volleys from 324 guns announced the Red Army's new victory to the whole world. For the Soviet people, this was another step on the road to final victory over fascism. The liberation of Minsk completed the first stage of Operation Bagration. In 11 days of fighting, the Red Army broke through the enemy's defenses on a 450-kilometer front and advanced 225 kilometers inland. Such a pace of advance was unprecedented on the Eastern Front. But Operation Bagration was not over yet. Ahead lay the advance towards the borders of Poland and East Prussia. The liberation of Minsk was not the end, but a new beginning in the Red Army's westward advance. The news of the liberation of Minsk struck the German leadership like a bolt from the blue. In the luxurious offices of the Reich Chancellery and the gloomy bunkers of the Führer's headquarters, an atmosphere reigned that could only be described as panic. What had seemed impossible just 2 weeks earlier had become a harsh reality. Hitler received a report on the loss of the Belarusian capital late in the evening of July 3. Witnesses recalled that the Führer flew into an indescribable rage. He demanded an immediate explanation of how such a catastrophe could have happened. Aides and generals received orders that were immediately cancelled and replaced with new, even more impossible ones. The chief of the general staff of the army, Colonel General Zeitzler, tried to explain the real situation on the Eastern Front to the Führer. But Hitler did not want to hear about difficulties and objective circumstances. He demanded an immediate counteroffensive and the return of lost positions. The scale of the disaster became more apparent with each passing hour. Army Group Center, which a month ago had numbered 43 divisions, had practically ceased to exist as an organized force. 17 divisions had been completely destroyed, and another 25 had lost more than half of their personnel. Propaganda Minister Goebbels understood that it would be impossible to hide the extent of the defeat from the German people. Too many families were waiting for letters from their sons and husbands serving in Army Group Center. Too many towns and villages would receive death notices. Public opinion had to be prepared urgently for the shocking news. On July 4, German radio broadcast the first reports of heavy fighting in Belarus. The announcer spoke of the heroic resistance of German troops against superior enemy forces. But even this cautious wording could not hide the main thing. The Red Army was winning victories on an unprecedented scale. Alarm reigned in the headquarters of other army groups. The commanders of army groups North and South Ukraine nervously studied maps, trying to understand whether the same fate awaited them. Reserves were hastily transferred to the sections of the front that seemed most threatened. Army Group North was particularly alarmed. The success of Operation Bagration opened a direct route to the Baltic states for Soviet troops. If the Red Army reached the Baltic Sea, the entire northern group of the Wehrmacht would be cut off from Germany. Field Marshal Schörner received orders to hold the corridor connecting East Prussia at all costs. The German Naval Command was also gripped by anxiety. The loss of the Baltic ports would mean the end of training for submarine crews in relatively safe waters. The Baltic would be transformed from an inner German sea into an arena of active combat, but the Luftwaffe command suffered the greatest shock. The Air Force of Army Group Center was almost completely destroyed in the first days of the operation. Airfields were captured or destroyed. Aircraft were shot down or abandoned during the retreat. Such losses had not been made up for months, and now they had to be compensated for in a matter of days. Hitler demanded that Göring immediately transfer air units from the Western Front to support the retreating troops. But the Reich Marshal was forced to report that the Air Force was also engaged in combat there. The Allies had just landed in Normandy, and every plane was needed. It was during these days that the German leadership realized that fighting a war on two fronts was becoming an unbearable burden for Germany. There were insufficient reserves in either the east or the west. Every decision to transfer troops to one direction weakened the other. On the evening of July 5, Hitler held an emergency meeting with his top military command. The agenda was brief: how to stop the Soviet offensive and prevent the complete collapse of the Eastern Front. But no one had any answers. The panic in Berlin was entirely justified. For the first time in the war, the German command found itself in a situation where the initiative had completely passed to the enemy and its own options for countering it had been exhausted. Operation Bagration was the beginning of the final offensive that would bring the Red Army to the walls of the Reich Chancellery. The success of Operation Bagration was achieved at the cost of enormous strain and considerable losses. By July 10, when the main phase of the operation was coming to an end, Soviet troops had advanced 450 kilometers westward, liberated almost the entire territory of Belarus, and reached the borders of Poland and Lithuania.
But behind this triumph were figures that make one think about the true cost of victory. The Red Army lost about 180,000 men killed, wounded, and missing during the operation.
This figure seems enormous, but in the context of the results achieved, it seems quite acceptable. The losses amounted to less than 8% of the total number of troops involved, a figure considered normal for offensive operations of this scale. German losses were incomparably greater. Army Group Center lost more than 400,000 men, almost half of its original strength. 350,000 soldiers and officers were taken prisoner, and another 70,000 died in battle. Such losses meant the virtual destruction of one of the largest formations of the Wehrmacht. The enemy's material losses were also enormous. The Red Army captured or destroyed 2,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, nearly 6,000 artillery pieces, and more than 57,000 vehicles. The German Air Force lost more than 800 aircraft, a figure that was simply catastrophic for the Luftwaffe in 1944. But the price of victory was not measured only in terms of human and material losses. Operation Bagration required a colossal strain on all the resources of the Soviet Union. More than 4 million shells and mines, hundreds of thousands of tons of fuel, and millions of food rations were used to carry it out. The railways operated at full capacity, delivering troops, equipment, and ammunition to the front. 78 train convoys were required to transport just 1/5 Guards Tank Corps. More than 10 such corps participated in the operation. The Soviet Union's industry worked tirelessly to make up for the losses of equipment and weapons. Tank factories in the Urals and Volga regions worked around the clock, producing new vehicles to replace those lost or damaged. Artillery factories increased their production of shells to record levels. But the heaviest price was paid by the Belarusian people for their liberation. 3 years of German occupation turned a flourishing republic into a scorched desert. Of the 9.5 million people who lived there before the war, less than 7 million survived. More than 2 million people were killed, tortured in concentration camps, or taken into slavery. Cities and villages lay in ruins. Minsk was 18% destroyed. Other large cities, 50–17%. Industry was completely destroyed and agriculture was devastated. Retreating German troops employed a scorched earth policy, blowing up bridges, destroying roads and burning crops. The fate of Belarusian Jews was particularly tragic. Of the 700,000 Jews who lived in the Republic before the war, fewer than 20,000 survived. The rest perished in ghettos and concentration camps, were shot in Khatyn and other places of mass extermination. Liberation brought not only joy, but also the bitterness of loss. Families searched for missing relatives, returned to their burned homes and tried to rebuild their destroyed lives. Many settlements simply disappeared from the face of the earth. Their inhabitants were killed and their homes burned down.
But despite all the losses and sacrifices, Operation Bagration was a turning point in the history of the Great Patriotic War.
For the first time in the entire conflict, the Red Army won a victory of such magnitude that the enemy simply could not recover from the defeat. The road to the west was open. The price of this victory was high, but it paid off in full. The defeat of Army Group Center brought the end of the war months closer and saved thousands of Soviet soldiers' lives in future battles. Most importantly, it gave millions of people hope for their final liberation from the fascist yoke. The memory of the heroes of Operation Bagration will forever remain in history. Their feat became a symbol of courage, self-sacrifice, and love for their homeland. They paid a high price for freedom, and this price must not be forgotten by future generations. The defeat of Army Group Center opened the way for the Red Army to the very heart of Germany. By mid-July 1944, Soviet troops were on the threshold of East Prussia and preparing to cross the Neman River, the last major water obstacle before the borders of the Reich. For the first time in the entire war, the prospect of final victory ceased to be a distant dream and became a tangible reality. The pace of the Soviet advance amazed even experienced military analysts from the Allied countries. In 3 weeks of fighting, the Red Army advanced 450 kilometers, further than in any of its previous operations. The front line moved from Vitebsk and Bobruisk to Kaunas and Grodno. All of Belarus was liberated, and Soviet troops entered Lithuania and Poland. The strategic situation on the Eastern Front changed dramatically. Before Operation Bagration, German troops could still count on stabilizing the situation with strong defensive lines, but now they had no such opportunity. The Red Army broke through the entire German defense system and gained freedom of maneuver. The situation of Army Group North became particularly critical. Soviet troops advancing from the Polotsk area threatened to reach the Baltic Sea near Riga. This would have meant the complete encirclement of the entire Baltic group of the Wehrmacht. More than 30 divisions would have been cut off from Germany. Field Marshal Scherner, who commanded Army Group North, frantically tried to create a new defensive line along the Dwina and Neman rivers. But he had neither the time nor the strength to organize a serious defense. Reserves were exhausted and the Soviet offensive was developing too rapidly. The situation was no less difficult for the new Army Group Center under the command of Field Marshal Model. This recognized master of defensive operations had to gather the remnants of the defeated units and form some semblance of a front. But there was catastrophically little material for such work. Model received reinforcements from Germany. Several new divisions formed from military academy cadets and militiamen. But these units had neither sufficient training nor combat experience. They could only serve as a temporary stopgap in the gaps that had formed, but were unable to stop the advance of the battle-hardened Soviet troops. The psychological effect of Operation Bagration was no less important than its material results. For the first time in the war, German soldiers felt that their army was not simply suffering defeat, but a genuine catastrophe. Confidence in the invincibility of the Wehrmacht was finally shattered. The allies in the anti-Hitler coalition watched the development of the Soviet offensive with admiration. Churchill telegraphed Stalin, "I congratulate you on the liberation of Minsk. Your summer successes have been truly amazing." Roosevelt also did not hide his delight at the scale of the Soviet victory. But most importantly, Operation Bagration radically changed the strategic situation in Europe. Now it was not the Allies who had to rush to open a second front to ease the Soviet Union's position, but Hitler who had to transfer troops from west to east in an attempt to prevent final collapse. The German command understood perfectly well that the loss of East Prussia would mean the end of the war. This territory was not just a province of the Reich, it was considered the cradle of Prussian militarism, a symbol of German military power. Its fall would have catastrophic consequences for the morale of both the army and the entire German people. By the end of July, Soviet troops had reached the borders of East Prussia and stopped to regroup and bring up reserves. Stalin understood that storming this heavily fortified area would require careful preparation and the concentration of maximum forces. The pause in the offensive was used to take stock of Operation Bagration. The results exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. Army Group Center was defeated, Belarus was liberated, and the road to Germany was open. The Red Army proved that it was capable not only of defending itself, but also of winning operations of any scale and complexity. The road to Berlin was open. All that remained was to follow it to the end, break the last desperate resistance of the dying Reich, and put an end to the bloodiest war in human history. Operation Bagration was a decisive step on this path. Operation Bagration unfolded at the very moment when Allied troops were landing on the shores of Normandy. On June 6, 1944, American, British and Canadian divisions under the command of General Eisenhower began the assault on the Atlantic Wall, a powerful system of German fortifications along the French coast. This was no coincidence. The coordination of the Allies' actions had reached the highest level. Back in November 1943, at the Tehran Conference, Stalin promised Churchill and Roosevelt that Soviet troops would launch a major offensive in the summer of 1944. This operation was intended to prevent the German command from transferring reserves from the Eastern Front to counter the Normandy landings. The Soviet leadership fulfilled its obligations with remarkable precision. Operation Bagration began 17 days after the Allied landings, when the German command had not yet assessed the scale of the threat in the West. Hitler and his generals were faced with the need to repel attacks on two fronts simultaneously. The psychological effect of the simultaneous Allied offensives was enormous. For the first time, the German leadership felt that it was fighting a united and well-coordinated enemy. Whereas previously it had been possible to count on periods of relative calm on one front or another, now that was no longer an option. The situation of the German reserves became particularly dire. Before Operation Bagration, army groups Center and North were considered quiet sections of the front, from which units could be painlessly withdrawn to reinforce threatened areas. Now, however, it was here that a catastrophe of unprecedented scale unfolded. Colonel General Jodl, Chief of Staff of the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht, later admitted that simultaneous strikes in the east and west had put the German command in a hopeless position. Any transfer of troops from one front to another immediately weakened the defense and created additional opportunities for the enemy. The Allied command closely monitored the progress of Operation Bagration. But British and American intelligence reported the transfer of German divisions from west to east to counter the Soviet offensive. This greatly facilitated the tasks of the expeditionary forces in Normandy. By the end of June, the Allies were able to establish a strong foothold on the French coast and begin landing their main forces. The German command was no longer able to concentrate all its reserves against the landings, as a significant portion had been urgently transferred to counter the Soviet offensive in Belarus. In his memoirs, Churchill particularly emphasized the importance of Operation Bagration for the success of the Normandy landings. In his words, the massive offensive by the Russian armies was the decisive factor that prevented the Germans from concentrating all their forces against us. The Prime Minister was right. The coordination of Allied actions had reached its peak. But the help was mutual. The Normandy landings also eased the situation for Soviet troops. The German command did not dare to withdraw troops from the Atlantic Wall to reinforce the Eastern Front, fearing an expansion of the Allied breachhead. Army groups B and C, defending the French coast, remained in the west. The fate of the elite SS tank divisions was particularly telling. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was transferred from Belgium to Normandy to repel the Allied landings. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend also fought against Anglo-American troops. These units were unable to take part in repelling the Soviet offensive. The coordination of Allied actions extended beyond land operations. Soviet aircraft intensified their attacks on communications in East Prussia at the very moment when Allied aircraft were launching massive strikes on railway junctions in France. The German transport system was hit from two sides at once. Diplomatic cooperation was also established at the highest level. Stalin regularly informed the Allies about the progress of Operation Bagration, while Churchill and Roosevelt shared information about the fighting in Normandy. Such openness was unprecedented during wartime. By the end of July, it was clear that the strategic initiative had finally passed to the Allies. In the east, the Red Army was crushing Army Group Center and threatening to invade East Prussia. In the west, Anglo-American troops broke through the front in Normandy and prepared to advance deep into France. Operation Bagration was a brilliant example of Allied cooperation. For the first time in the war, such a degree of coordination was achieved that the enemy was unable to effectively counter simultaneous strikes in different theaters of war. This heralded the imminent end of the war and the victory of the anti-Hitler coalition. Operation Bagration ended on August 29, 1944, with the liberation of the last areas of Belarus and the Red Army reaching the borders of East Prussia. In 2 months of continuous fighting, Soviet troops advanced 600 kilometers, liberated a huge territory, and inflicted a defeat on the enemy on such a scale that the German armed forces were unable to recover before the end of the war. The strategic results of the operation are striking in their scale. Army Group Center ceased to exist as an organized force. Of the 43 divisions that made up the group at the start of the operation, 17 were completely destroyed, and the rest lost between 50 and 80% of their personnel. The enemy's total losses amounted to more than 450,000 killed and captured. The territorial gains were no less impressive. The Red Army liberated all of Belarus, a significant part of Lithuania, the western regions of Latvia, and the eastern regions of Poland. The front line moved 400 to 600 kilometers westward, bringing the final victory months closer. But what makes Operation Bagration unique in the annals of military history is not only the scale of the results achieved, but also the manner in which they were achieved. The Soviet command demonstrated the highest art of strategic planning, operational concealment, and coordination of large military formations. The disinformation campaign that preceded the offensive is a classic example of military cunning. The German command was so thoroughly misled that the commander-in-chief of Army Group Center considered it possible to take a vacation on the eve of the biggest battle. No army in the world had ever achieved such success in military intelligence and counterintelligence. The tactical innovations of the operation also deserve attention. The simultaneous attack on 6 fronts deprived the enemy of the ability to maneuver reserves and created conditions for multiple breakthroughs and encirclements. This tactic became a model for subsequent offensive operations of the Red Army. The coordination of the actions of 4 fronts, long-range aviation, and partisan detachments reached an unprecedented level. Each element of this complex system acted in strict accordance with the overall plan, which ensured maximum efficiency of the operation with minimal losses. Operation Bagration was a turning point not only in the Great Patriotic War, but in the entire Second World War. It finally buried Hitler's hopes for a separate peace with one of his enemies. Now Germany had to fight to the point of complete exhaustion against a united and invincible coalition. The international significance of the operation cannot be overestimated. The Allies received indisputable proof of the military power of the Soviet Union and its ability to independently determine the outcome of the war. This strengthened the USSR's position in negotiations on the post-war world order and determined the spheres of influence in Europe. But the main lesson of Operation Bagration lies in the demonstration of the capabilities of the human spirit when it is directed toward achieving just goals. Soviet soldiers and officers did not fight for abstract geopolitical interests, but for the liberation of their homeland from invaders. This motivation made them virtually invincible. The Belarusian people paid a terrible price for their freedom. More than 2 million residents of the Republic died during the years of occupation. But their sacrifice was not in vain. Operation Bagration was an act of historical justice, a reward for all the suffering and humiliation. Military technology also received a powerful boost. The massive use of tank corps, the coordination of various branches of the armed forces, and the use of aviation to support ground operations all became the basis of post-war military doctrine. The memory of Operation Bagration lives on, in the names of streets and squares in liberated cities, in monuments and memorials, and in the hearts of grateful descendants. It was an operation that changed the course of history and brought the dawn of peace closer to war-torn Europe. 79 years later, Operation Bagration remains an unmatched example of military art and a model of how a people fighting for a just cause can overcome any obstacle on the path to victory. Its lessons are still relevant today, as the world once again faces the threat of aggression and the need to defend the fundamental values of human civilization.